A lone ship drifts in the silent dark. This is the frantic opening scene of our sci-fi thriller audiobook, The Interstellar Conspiracy That Changed Everything. A single, encrypted transmission cuts through the void from the derelict research vessel Odyssey's call. Its final words are a chilling warning. They lied about the void. The stars are not what they seem. This cryptic message propels Commander Jax Orion into a mystery that will unravel the very fabric of known space. By the end of this story, you will uncover a secret so vast, it redefines humanity's place in the cosmos. What would you do if you discovered everything you knew was a carefully constructed lie? Commander Orion's ship, the Aegis, tore through the void on an emergency vector. The frantic signal from the Odyssey's call was a ghost, a whisper from a ship that should not have been anywhere near this dead sector of space. Their long-range scanners finally painted a picture, and the crew fell silent. There she was, the research vessel, hanging motionless in the oppressive dark. But it was what loomed beside her that stole the breath from every person on the bridge. A pulsar, a cosmic lighthouse that should have been screaming across every frequency with rhythmic pulses of radiation, was utterly and terrifyingly silent. It was a corpse star, dormant in a way that defied every law of astrophysics they knew. The Odyssey's call was drifting in the shadow of an impossibility. Docking was a tense, airless procedure. The Aegis connected with the derelict ship, its airlocks groaning in protest. Orion led the boarding party into a tomb. The corridors were cold and dark, lit only by the emergency beams of their suits. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just an overwhelming sense of abandonment. They fought their way to the bridge, hoping the ship's central log would hold the answers. What they found was a digital graveyard. Every primary and secondary data core had been systematically scrubbed, wiped cleaner than a blank slate. It was a professional job, leaving not a single byte of data behind. The silence of the ship was now a deafening statement. Someone or something did not want this ship's story to be told. Just as despair began to set in, a junior tech found it. Tucked away in an isolated, non-networked diagnostic module, a single data fragment had survived the purge. It was not a log entry or a captain's final report. It was a star map. The chart itself was unfamiliar, using archaic coordinate systems that their navigation computers struggled to parse. But one feature was unmistakable: a glaring crimson warning overlay plastered across a specific sector. It was a place every pilot learned to avoid in their basic training, a region of space designated as forbidden by the Unified Stellar Command. No explanations were ever given, only a strict, non-negotiable directive to stay away. The message from the Odyssey's call now echoed in Orion's mind with terrifying clarity. They lied about the void. This map was the call's final, desperate act, a breadcrumb leading directly into the heart of that lie. Without a word, Orion turned from the lifeless console and marched back to the Aegis. The crew followed, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. On the bridge, he input the new coordinates himself. The navigation officer looked up, a question dying on his lips as he saw the resolve on his commander's face. The star map was their only lead, a siren's call from a forbidden sector. The Aegis disengaged from the ghost ship, its engines humming with renewed purpose. With a silent, non-emitting pulsar at their backs and a mystery ahead, the ship pivoted and plunged into the unknown, its course set for the one place in the galaxy they were ordered never to go. The silence of the forbidden sector was a physical weight against the hull of the Aegis. As the ship edged closer to the coordinates from the salvaged map, the long-range sensors began to register a faint, persistent hum. It was not the empty hiss of dead space, but a structured signal so perfectly blended with the cosmic background radiation that it had been designed to be overlooked. Commander Orion ordered a full spectral analysis, and Science Officer Lin's console lit up with a cascade of data. It was not a message in any language they recognized. It was a river of numbers, a repeating sequence of prime numbers and irrational constants flowing on a carrier wave that felt ancient. The pattern was elegant, complex, and utterly alien. Lin worked for hours, her fingers flying across the interface as she tried one decryption protocol after another. Every known model, from military-grade ciphers to theoretical quantum locks, failed to make sense of the stream. It was like trying to read a book by listening to the sound of rain. The breakthrough came not from force, but from a shift in perspective. Lin stopped treating it as a language to be translated and started seeing it as a structure to be understood. She mapped the numerical relationships, and a hidden architecture began to emerge. The code was a shell, an onion with countless layers, but she managed to peel back the first one. The revelation sent a cold jolt through the entire bridge. The beautiful, complex math was not a greeting or a warning, it was a clock, a precise, unwavering countdown. The numbers were ticking downward, and based on her calculations, the terminus was not some distant future event. It was imminent. The clock was not measuring years or months, but mere hours. A new urgency gripped the crew. The derelict ship, the silent pulsar, the forbidden sector, it was all connected to this final, ticking moment. The Aegis was not just investigating a mystery anymore. They were racing against a deadline set by an intelligence beyond their understanding. A countdown to an event whose nature they could not even begin to guess. The countdown was a drumbeat in their minds, every second a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass. The Aegis pushed forward, its sensors straining to pinpoint the source of the alien signal. Then, space itself seemed to ripple 100 kilometers off their starboard bow. A sleek, dagger-shaped warship materialized from nothing, its hull a matte black that drank the starlight. No identification markers, no standard transponder codes. It was a ghost, and it was directly in their path. A voice, stripped of all warmth and inflection, crackled over the comm. "This is the Sentinel. You have violated a quarantined sector. Power down your engines and prepare for a full data core purge. Surrender all logs and recovered artifacts." The silence that followed was heavier than the void outside. Commander Orion's hands tightened on his command chair. "We are on a mission of discovery," he responded, his voice steady. "We have recovered evidence." The reply was instantaneous and final. "Your mission is irrelevant. Your evidence is a contagion. Turn your vessel around now, or you will be erased from the stellar records." The finality in that cold voice was absolute. Erased was not just a threat of destruction. It was a promise of oblivion, that they and their ship would become a footnote that never existed. On the tactical display, the Sentinel's weapons ports glowed with a malevolent crimson light. They were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Evasive pattern Delta. Orion barked. Now, the Aegis shuddered as its engines roared, throwing the massive ship into a violent lateral slide. Crimson lances of energy sliced through the space they had occupied a moment before. The Sentinel pivoted with impossible grace, its own engines flaring to pursue. Their only chance was a churning cloud of ionized gas and cosmic dust visible on the long-range scans, a nearby nebula. "Helm, full power to the engines, get us into that nebula." The Aegis shot forward, a minnow fleeing a shark. The nebula's outer tendrils enveloped them, the static washing over their sensors like a tidal wave, swallowing them whole as they fled from an enemy that wanted not just their lives, but their very story. The nebula's chaotic static was a shroud, a welcome blindness that hid them from their pursuer. Inside the churning cloud, the Aegis drifted, its own sensors struggling against the interference. It was within this violent camouflage that their scanners picked up the anomaly, a solid, geometric shape where there should have been only formless gas. The crew watched mesmerized as the long-range images resolved on the main viewer. It was a station, a colossal derelict of sweeping, organic curves and sharp, crystalline angles, a design that belonged to no human architectural school. Science Officer Lin confirmed it with a hushed voice. The structure was not just old. It was ancient, its core frame predating humanity's first tentative steps into orbit. And it was broadcasting. The faint numerical signal they had been tracking was emanating from its very heart, stronger and clearer than ever before. Commander Orion stared at the silent behemoth, a relic from a time before his species had even looked up at the stars with understanding. The Sentinel wanted this secret buried. The Odyssey's call died for uncovering it. To turn away now was to surrender to the lie. His decision was immediate. Prep a shuttle. I am leading a boarding party. The risks were incalculable. They had no idea what atmosphere, if any, remained inside, or what dormant systems might still be active. But the ghost signal was a siren's call, and the countdown was still ticking relentlessly in the background. The answers were there, inside that silent, impossible architecture. The shuttle detached from the Aegis and flew towards the derelict, a tiny speck approaching a sleeping giant. As they drew closer, the sheer scale of the station became overwhelming, a city-sized monument to a forgotten builder. They maneuvered towards a gaping hangar bay, its energy shields long dead, and set down on a deck that had not felt a footfall in millennia. The air was thin and cold, carrying the metallic taste of ages. Their suit lights cut beams through the profound darkness, illuminating corridors that seemed grown rather than built. There were no control panels they recognized, no chairs or screens. Everything was smooth, seamless, and utterly alien. They moved deeper into the station, following the strengthening signal, a trail of numbers leading them into the belly of the beast. They were walking through a museum of a dead civilization, and the exhibit was a single, terrifying countdown to 0. The corridors curved in ways that defied human engineering, their walls smooth and warm to the touch. Commander Orion's team moved deeper into the station's heart, their lights gliding over surfaces that seemed almost organic. They entered a vast, circular chamber, and the air shifted. It was here they found the first bodies. They were not skeletons in any human sense, but delicate, crystalline frameworks, arranged in silent, seated circles as if in a final communal gathering. Their forms were elegant, with long, articulated limbs and faces that suggested a profound, eternal sadness. This was a tomb, not a battlefield. Science Officer Lin scanned one of the remains, her voice a whisper in the comms. The readings indicate a biology based on silicon and light. Their very bodies were a form of technology. As she spoke, a low hum filled the chamber. A section of the wall, previously seamless, ear-eyed open, revealing a console of pulsating liquid light. A beam shot from its core, and a figure materialized before them. It was a hologram, a being of the same species as the silent bodies around them, its form shimmering with a gentle luminescence. It spoke, not in words, but in a cascade of pure mathematical concepts and emotional impressions that their universal translators struggled to interpret. The meaning, however, was unmistakable. "We are the Zhar," the impression flowed. "We were the gardeners of the galaxy, the weavers of life. We sought only harmony." The hologram showed them visions of a civilization that built with living light, that communicated through shared thought, that seeded worlds with the potential for life. They were explorers, not conquerors, and then the record shifted. The serene images fractured, replaced by a chilling emptiness. A wave of nothingness began to spread from a distant sector of space. The Zhar had no word for it, but the impression they received was a void that consumed not just matter, but information, memory, and light itself. The silent scourge, as the translation resolved, left no wreckage, no energy signatures. It simply erased. World after world of the Zhar went dark, their songs extinguished forever. This station was one of their last observatories. a final attempt to understand the unstoppable tide of oblivion that was coming for them. The holographic Zhar looked at them, its projected form radiating a sorrow that spanned eons, and then it delivered its final, devastating truth. The scourge did not originate from some distant alien realm. It was born here in this very galaxy, a weapon of unimaginable power that had been turned upon its creators. The silent scourge was not a natural disaster. It was a genocide. The team stood in the chamber, surrounded by the peaceful dead, their own history textbooks crumbling to dust in their minds. Humanity had been taught it was alone, that it was the first and only intelligence to reach for the stars. That was the lie. The entire foundation of their civilization, every triumph and discovery, was built upon the graveyard of a people who had been utterly erased from existence. The silence that followed was heavier than the void of space, filled with the ghosts of a billion souls they never knew were missing. The records shifted again, the serene sorrow of the Zhar hardening into something colder. The silent scourge was not a weapon they had built, nor a force of nature. It was a predator. The data stream clarified the entity was a parasitic, energy-based life form, a consciousness that fed on consciousness itself. It did not consume planets or stars. It devoured thought, memory, and the very spark of sentience, leaving behind the beautiful, empty shells they had found. The Zhar, with their interconnected minds and luminous biology, were not just victims. They were a perfect feast. This explained the pristine derelicts, the ships and stations left physically intact but spiritually hollowed out. The entity left no mark because it consumed the only thing that mattered, the life within. A new, chilling detail emerged from the ancient data. The entity had not simply stumbled upon the Zhar civilization. The records indicated a faint, artificial energy signature at the point of first contact, a technological lure that had drawn the parasite directly to the Zhar homeworld. It was a deliberate act, a betrayal of cosmic proportions. Someone had unleashed this horror upon them. The holographic Zhar looked upon the human crew, its form flickering with the last of its stored energy. The emotional impression it conveyed was no longer just sorrow. It was a profound, weary resolve. It showed them a single set of coordinates, different from the ones that had led them here. This was the location of a hidden research outpost, a place the Zhar called their final hope. It was there that their greatest minds had worked to find a weakness in the entity, a way to fight back against the devourer of souls. The work was unfinished, interrupted by the Scourge's final, inexorable advance. The being's form began to dissolve into motes of light, its final message a clear, desperate plea that echoed not in their ears, but in their very minds. Finish the work. The light vanished, and the chamber returned to the profound, ancient dark, leaving Commander Orion and his team alone with the ghosts of a genocide, and a responsibility they never asked for. The countdown was still ticking. It was not a clock for the Zhar. Their time was long past. This countdown was for the next course in the entity's endless hunger, a meal that might very well be humanity itself. The coordinates to the outpost glowed on their navigational display, a final inheritance from a dead people and their only hope for survival. The silence of the ancient station shattered. Alarms screamed through the comms as the entire structure shuddered from a massive impact. The unmarked warship was here, and it was not just waiting. It was firing directly on the Zhar relic, determined to blast their discovery into cosmic dust. "We have to move now," Commander Orion yelled, his hand closing around the central data crystal. It pulsed with a soft, warm light, the entire recorded history of a dead civilization now their sole responsibility. They sprinted back through the organic corridors as the station groaned around them, crystalline supports fracturing under the relentless barrage. Reaching their shuttle felt like a race against a collapsing star. They launched just as a volley of crimson energy sheared through the chamber they had occupied moments before, vaporizing the peaceful circle of Zhar remains. The sight on the view screen was a gut punch. The ancient station, a monument to a lost people, erupted into a blinding, silent fireball, its legacy erased in an instant. The Sentinel hung against the expanding cloud of debris, a black dagger silhouetted by the destruction it had wrought. It immediately turned its guns on them. The shuttle weaved through the dissipating wreckage, its smaller size its only advantage as it made a desperate run for the Aegis. The mothership was already moving, laying down covering fire to give them a path home. The moment the shuttle docked and the data crystal was secured, the Aegis shot forward, its engines screaming under the strain. The Sentinel matched their acceleration with terrifying ease, its weapons locking on. They were being herded, driven away from the nebula and into open space where they would be an easy target. "We cannot outrun it," the helmsman reported, his voice tight. Commander Orion stared at the tactical display, the new coordinates from the Jar burning in his mind. There was only one path. Helm, plot a new course. Directly for the Kyperos Belt. The bridge crew fell silent. The Kyperos Belt was a navigator's nightmare, a dense and chaotic field of tumbling planetoids and razor-sharp debris, known for tearing even shielded freighters apart. It was a suicide run, but it was also their only chance. The Sentinel would never follow them in. Or if it did, its superior size and speed would become a fatal liability. The Aegis dove into the maelstrom. The view screen became a dizzying whirl of spinning rock and sudden, terrifying voids. Every alarm on the bridge blared at once as proximity warnings flashed red. The helmsman's hands were a blur, executing micro-corrections that sent the massive ship sliding between mountain-sized asteroids with only meters to spare. Behind them, the Sentinel hesitated for a single, glorious moment at the belt's edge. Then, with a cold fury, it followed. It was a dance of death. The Aegis, smaller and more agile, threaded the needle. The Sentinel, forced to use its powerful energy weapons to blast a path through the larger obstacles, was slowed, its precise movements becoming clumsy and reactive. A massive asteroid, shattered by a Sentinel blast, sent a cloud of shrapnel directly into the warship's path. They watched on the rear display as a jagged piece of rock, the size of a building, carved a deep, glowing trench along the Sentinel's port side. It was not a killing blow, but it was a wound. The warship's pursuit faltered, its systems momentarily overwhelmed. It was the break they needed. The Aegis shot out of the far side of the asteroid field, its hull scarred and bleeding atmosphere from a dozen minor impacts, but intact. The coordinates of the Zhar outpost glowed steadily ahead. They had escaped the hunter, but they carried with them the chilling knowledge that someone was willing to obliterate an entire chapter of galactic history to keep this secret buried. The chaos of the asteroid field was a blur of screaming metal and flashing red alerts. Then, a single, insistent chime cut through the bedlam. A Priority 1 channel, flagged with the highest encryption protocols of the Unified Stellar Command, was pinging their communications array. Commander Orion, his hands gripping the command chair, gave a sharp nod to open the channel. The voice that filled the bridge was crisp, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. It was Admiral Valerius, the man who had personally signed their original exploration charter. His orders were unambiguous. The Aegis was to cease its current trajectory immediately, power down all non-essential systems, and return to the nearest command outpost for a full debriefing. The mission was officially terminated. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over the bridge. They were saved. They had orders, but Orion did not move. He listened to the message again, his eyes narrowing. The authentication codes were perfect, the voice print a flawless match. Yet something was off. The phrasing was just a little too rigid, the cadence a fraction too precise. It was like listening to a perfect replica of a song, performed by a musician who had never felt its emotion. Valerius was a strategist, a man who spoke in broad concepts and trusted his commanders. This message was a checklist of threats and compliance, devoid of the Admiral's characteristic trust. This was not a recall. It was a forgery, a deep-level fake so expertly crafted that only someone who knew the man intimately would spot the flaw. The conspiracy was not just out here in the dark. It had roots, deep and poisonous, inside Galactic Command itself. Someone at the very top, someone with the authority to mimic an admiral, wanted them to stand down and return to be silenced. The cold realization settled in his gut. They were not just fugitives from an unknown enemy. They were now traitors in the eyes of their own government, pawns in a game whose rules were written by the very people they were supposed to trust. The Kaipero's belt was no longer just an obstacle. It was their only sanctuary. The forged recall order hung in the air, a ghost of the command structure they could no longer trust. With the Sentinel licking its wounds somewhere in the asteroid field, the Aegis raced towards the coordinates, a single point of light in a sea of treacherous debris. Their destination was not a planet or a star, but a nondescript, potato-shaped planetoid tumbling slowly in the void. Scans showed a solid rock surface, completely inert. It was only when they matched its exact rotational velocity and approached within 100 meters that their sensors finally pierced the illusion. The entire planetoid was a shell, a hollowed-out rock concealing a technological marvel beneath a perfect stealth field. A massive hangar bay door, seamless and invisible until that moment, ear-rised open in the asteroid's surface, inviting them into the heart of the mountain. Inside, the air was still and cool, preserved for millennia. The architecture was unmistakably Zhar, all flowing curves and soft, internal light. But unlike the tomb-like station, this place hummed with latent power. Consoles of liquid light pulsed with a steady, waiting rhythm. They had found the final hope. In the central chamber, they discovered the project. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense. Science Officer Lin called it a resonant frequency emitter, a device designed to broadcast a single, complex wave pattern across an entire star system. The principle was elegant, a form of cosmic therapy. The energy entity, the devourer of consciousness, was a chaotic, dissonant presence. The emitter was built to generate a perfect, stabilizing harmony, a frequency that would pacify the entity, calming its predatory nature into a state of passive, harmless slumber. It was a lullaby for a god. The device itself was breathtaking, a sculpture of interwoven crystals and light. It was fully assembled, a completed masterpiece waiting for its conductor. But the central housing, the core that would focus and amplify the harmonic wave, was empty. The Zhar records revealed the final, cruel twist. The emitter required a specific quantum crystal to function, a mineral so rare the Zhar had only ever theorized its existence. They had spent their final years searching for it, a quest that ended when the silence took them. The crystal's structure needed to be flawless, capable of resonating with the fundamental frequency of sentient thought itself. Without it, the emitter was just a beautiful, inert monument. They had found the cure, but the one ingredient needed to activate it was a ghost, a myth lost to the same eons that had consumed its creators. The solution to their nightmare existed, yet it remained utterly out of reach, a final, mocking challenge from a dead race. The crystal was not lost to the eons. The Zhar logs held one final, desperate entry. In their last days, they made contact. They chose a single human, a brilliant xenogeologist named Dr. Eris Thorn, and entrusted him with the one existing prototype of the quantum crystal. They saw in his species a chaotic, resilient spark, a potential they themselves had lost. Thorn took the crystal and fled, intending to deliver it to the one place he thought it would be safe, a secret research outpost on the fringe of human space. His ship, the Event Horizon, never arrived. It vanished without a trace, and Dr. Eris Thorn was officially declared dead. Another name on the long list of explorers lost to the void. The conspiracy had not just erased the Zhar. It had hunted down and silenced the one man who could have saved everyone. Commander Orion's Team Cross referenced the old flight logs with contemporary astrometric data. Thorn's last known trajectory pointed like a grim arrow into a sector of space every pilot feared: the Silent Vale. It was not just a navigational hazard. It was a graveyard, a dense interstellar nebula choked with the derelict hulls of centuries of lost ships, from early colony vessels to modern warships, all dragged off course by the Vale's unnaturally powerful and chaotic gravitational tides. It was a place of ghosts and static, officially quarantined by Galactic Command for being too dangerous to traverse. The coincidence was too perfect. Thorn's ship had not simply been lost. It had been driven there, forced into a tomb from which no one ever returned. The Aegis floated at the edge of the Silent Vale, its crew staring into the swirling, opaque mist. Recovering the crystal meant flying into a labyrinth of wreckage and unpredictable gravity, a place where one wrong calculation would see them added to the collection of ghosts. It was a salvage operation against impossible odds, a search for a single, tiny object in a field of cosmic ruin, but the countdown in the back of their minds had not stopped. The entity was still out there, and the forged recall order proved the conspiracy was closing in. The Vale was not just a graveyard, it was a hiding place, and they had to be the ones to find what was hidden. Every system was checked and rechecked. The shuttles were prepped for a kind of flying no simulation could ever train them for. They were going in. The swirling gray mist of the Silent Vale closed around the Aegis like a shroud. Navigation became a crawl, their sensors screaming with false echoes from the mangled hulls of ancient ships drifting all around them. It was a cosmic boneyard, a silent testament to centuries of failed voyages. For hours, they wove through the graveyard, their scanners probing the spectral fog for the unique hull signature of the event horizon. Then, a faint ping echoed on the bridge. There she was, nestled within the twisted skeleton of a massive colony hauler, her hull scarred but seemingly whole. Dr. Thorn's ship was a ghost, but she was intact. Docking was a delicate, nerve-wracking procedure. The Aegis extended its umbilical, connecting with the derelict's airlock. The seal hissed, and the team stepped into a tomb frozen in time. The air was thin and stale, the corridors dark and cold. Emergency lights, powered by some residual trickle of energy, cast long, dancing shadows. Their own footsteps echoed in the profound silence. They moved carefully through the ship, following a schematic towards the main science lab. It was there that their scanners picked it up, faint but unmistakable. A low-level power signature, a steady thrum of energy emanating from the ship's core, far deeper than the emergency systems should have been capable of producing. Something on the event horizon was still alive. The air inside the event horizon tasted of dust and decades. Their boots echoed on the deck plating as they followed the faint power signature deeper into the ship's cold heart. It led them past silent crew quarters and darkened labs, a trail of ghosts leading to a single, sealed door marked cryogenics. The panel beside it glowed with a soft, steady green light. Inside, the chamber was a forest of humming machinery and frosted glass tubes. Most were dark and empty, but one, at the center of the room, held a figure suspended in blue-tinged light. It was Dr. Eris Thorn, preserved not as a corpse, but as a man merely sleeping, his face peaceful against the slow march of time. A data slate was fixed to the front of his pod, its screen alive with text. Commander Orion reached out and tapped the screen, initiating the playback. Thorn's voice, thin and strained with a fear that had lasted centuries, filled the silent room. His logs were a confession and a warning. He explained how he had been chosen, how the Zhar had shown him the truth of the entity and given him the crystal. But he had been discovered. A shadowy cabal within the highest levels of Galactic Command, a group he called the Vale, had learned of the entity's existence. They did not see it as a threat to be neutralized. They saw it as the ultimate weapon, a tool for absolute control. A devourer of consciousness could silence entire worlds without a single shot being fired, leaving populations physically intact but mentally hollowed out, perfect puppets. Thorn knew he could not let them have the crystal, so he staged his death, using a pre-planned gravitational slingshot maneuver to hurl his ship into the Silent Vale, a place so dangerous his pursuers would assume he was destroyed. He placed himself in cryo-sleep, a prisoner in his own ship, waiting for a rescue he knew might never come. He hid the quantum crystal somewhere aboard the event horizon, a secret he would only reveal upon his awakening. The Vale was not just a conspiracy, it was a cancer. They had orchestrated the cover-up of the Zhar genocide, they had sent the Sentinel to erase evidence, and they had forged the recall order for the Aegis. They believed they could control the monster, harnessing a force that had wiped out a galaxy-spanning civilization for their own political ends. Thorn's final log entry was a single, desperate plea. Wake me, the choice was now before them. Thawing Thorn was a risk. His body could fail, his mind could be fractured by the long sleep. But he was the only one who knew where the crystal was hidden. He was the living key to the only weapon that could save them all. A man who had sacrificed everything to hide from the very enemy that now hunted them. The cryo chamber hissed, venting plumes of supercooled vapor as the pod's systems whirred to life. Dr. Eris Thorn gasped, his body convulsing as decades of metabolic suspension reversed in a violent rush. His eyes fluttered open, wide with a primal, disoriented terror. It took long minutes for his breathing to steady, for the ancient fear to recede and for recognition to settle in as he saw the uniforms of his rescuers. He confirmed it all, his voice a dry rasp weaving a tale of galactic arrogance. The Vale did not just discover the entity, they provoked it. In their hunger for a limitless power source, they sent a deep space probe into the entity's dormant domain, poking a sleeping beast with a stick of pure energy. They thought they were tapping a new well. Instead, they were ringing a dinner bell. The entity, a consciousness that fed on thought, followed the probe's trail back to its makers, but found the Zhar first. Their luminous, interconnected civilization was a banquet laid out before a starving king. The Vale, in their reckless ambition, had accidentally unleashed a genocide. Thorn's hands trembled as he reached for a hidden panel beneath his cryo tube, his fingers working a sequence known only to him. With a soft click, a compartment opened, revealing a velvet-lined case. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was the quantum crystal. It was smaller than any of them had imagined, no larger than his thumb, yet it seemed to contain a universe within its flawless, geometric depths. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, humming with a potential that vibrated in the very air around it. This unassuming sliver of mineral was the final piece of the puzzle, the one component that could turn a silent monument into a galaxy-saving lullaby. They held the cure in their hands, but the disease was already spreading, and the doctors who had created it were now determined to administer the poison themselves. The crystal felt impossibly heavy in Commander Orion's hand, a sliver of concentrated hope humming with latent power. But that hope curdled into cold dread as the first impact rocked the event horizon. The entire derelict ship groaned, metal shrieking in protest. On the main viewer, relayed from the Aegis, the gray mist of the Silent Vale was now alive with the crimson signatures of warships. A full fleet, led by the familiar dagger shape of the Sentinel, had surrounded the graveyard. They were trapped, flies in a cosmic web. Communications erupted into a wall of static, a brutal jamming field sealing them in utter silence. They were cut off, not just from help, but from the universe itself. Dr. Thorn gripped a console, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "They are using a full-spectrum dampening field," he said, his voice cutting through the panic. "Standard protocols say it is impenetrable, but I helped design it. There is a flaw, a harmonic instability they could never fully eliminate. He called up a star chart, his fingers tracing a path that made the navigation officer blanch. It leads directly through the Twin Furies, a binary pulsar system. The screen displayed two neutron stars locked in a violent, decaying dance, spinning wildly and blasting the space around them with waves of lethal radiation and gravitational shear. The corridor Thorn indicated was a hypothetical thread, a sliver of stable space that existed for mere moments between the pulsar's overlapping fields. It was not a route, it was a gauntlet. One miscalculation, one fraction of a second off, and the Aegis would be torn into subatomic dust or cooked from the inside out by radiation. The Sentinel and its fleet would never follow. It was a tactical nightmare, a place where their superior numbers meant nothing. It was a suicide run, but it was the only door out of the tomb they were in. Orion looked from Thorn's determined face to the terrified crew on the bridge. They had the cure for a galactic plague in their possession, and the architects of that plague were at the door. Staying meant capture, the crystal lost, and humanity doomed to a controlled, silent extinction. Running meant facing a cosmic meat grinder. The decision was written in the grim set of his jaw. He transmitted a single, tight beam command to the Aegis. Prepare for emergency departure. We are going through the Furies. The Aegis tore free from the graveyard of ships, its engines screaming as it shot towards the swirling, violent heart of the Twin Furies. The view ahead was not empty space, but a churning canvas of lethal energy. Two neutron stars spun in a frantic, decaying orbit, lashing the void with invisible gravitational whips and visible waves of emerald and crimson radiation. Thorn's voice was a calm, steady counterpoint to the chaos, feeding complex equations to the helm. The corridor is not a road. It is a heartbeat, a pulse of stability that exists for 3.7 seconds every 42. You must hit the exact center. The Vale fleet, confident in their trap, surged after them. The lead pursuer, a cruiser larger than the Sentinel, misjudged the opening gravitational shear. One moment it was there, the next, it was gone. Its hull silently and instantly pancaked into an unrecognizable smear of metal by forces that could crush a planet. A second ship, veering to avoid the debris, drifted a fraction too far into the radiation zone. Its shields flared white-hot and then failed. The crew on the Aegis watched in horrified silence as the ship's outer hull began to glow, then melt, its silhouette dissolving like a sugar cube in water. The Vale's formation shattered into panicked, evasive maneuvers. Inside the Aegis, it was a different kind of storm. The ship groaned and shuddered, its structural integrity field flashing constant, dire warnings. Alarms blared as radiation levels crept past safe limits, the humming of the shielding a constant, high-pitched whine in the background. The helmsman's hands were locked on the controls, his face a mask of concentration as he followed Thorn's numbers with a pilot's instinct, dancing on the edge of a razor. They were not flying a ship anymore. They were riding a lightning bolt through a hurricane. A sudden, violent tremor racked the Aegis, and a secondary explosion echoed from the engineering deck. They had clipped the very edge of the gravitational tide, a brush with a force that left a deep, scorched gash along their port side. Atmosphere vented into the void before emergency bulkheads slammed shut. But they were through. As suddenly as it began, the maelstrom fell behind them. The Twin Furies receded in their rear display, two furious dots of light spinning in their eternal, deadly dance. The Aegis drifted in the calm, quiet space beyond, a wounded beast bleeding air and trailing a cloud of debris. The Vale fleet was gone, either destroyed or forced to retreat. They had broken the blockade, but the cost was written in the scarred metal and flickering consoles of their ship. They had the crystal, and they had their freedom, but the path ahead was darker and more uncertain than ever. A fragile silence settled over the wounded Aegis. The adrenaline of their escape from the Twin Furies had faded. leaving behind the stark reality of a damaged ship and a divided purpose. In the main briefing room, the ideological fault line cracked open. Dr. Thorne stood over the central display, the quantum crystal glowing beside the schematics for the Jar Emitter. His voice was urgent, frayed by centuries of waiting. "We have the key. Every moment we delay is a moment the entity moves closer, or the Vale rebuilds its fleet. We must go to the outpost and activate the device. Now." Commander Orion watched him, his arms crossed. His own reflection was a mosaic of scars on the dark screen. "Activating it is only half the battle, Doctor. If we use this lullaby and then just go home, nothing changes. The Vale remains in power. They will just find another way, another weapon. They have to be exposed. The entire galaxy needs to know the truth about the Zhar, about the genocide they caused." The argument escalated, a tense volley of fears and principles. Thorne painted a picture of imminent, silent extinction, a threat that demanded immediate, decisive action. Orion countered with the long shadow of tyranny, a conspiracy that would simply find a new monster to wield if this one was put to sleep. The crew members present shifted uncomfortably, their loyalties stretching in two different directions. The ship's pilot, a woman who had just navigated a binary pulsar, spoke quietly. "He is right, Commander. We cannot fight a war on two fronts. We need to choose." The science officer, who had decoded the alien signal, looked at the crystal. "But if we do not activate the emitter, there may not be a galaxy left to save." The conflict was no longer about a simple course heading. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies, a choice between solving the immediate symptom or curing the terminal disease. Trust, hardened in the fires of escape, began to show its first fractures. The unity that had carried them through the graveyard and the maelstrom was threatening to shatter at the most critical juncture of all. The standoff in the briefing room dissolved into a tense, uncertain quiet. Neither course of action felt complete, and the weight of their impossible choice pressed down on them all. It was in this stalemate that a single, fragmented data packet sliced through their most secure channel. It was not a voice, but text, a string of numbers and letters that resolved into a set of coordinates buried deep within the swirling bands of a gas giant named Polyphemus. The message was anonymous, its origin encrypted beyond any trace. It claimed that hidden within that violent atmosphere was a Vale data hub, a secret listening post that held a complete registry of the conspiracy's agents, their financial networks, and their long-term plans for control. It was the proof they needed, the leverage to expose the entire rotten structure. The informant's final line was a stark warning: the Vale is preparing to move the hub. You have one cycle before it is gone forever. The decision was made for them. A direct assault was impossible. A gas giant's atmosphere was a chaotic soup of hurricane-force winds and crushing pressure, a perfect natural shield. The hub would be a needle in a planetary haystack, protected by the environment itself. But if they could get in and out without being detected, they would hold the key to dismantling the conspiracy from the inside. This was not about choosing between Orion's exposure and Thorne's solution anymore. It was about acquiring the one thing that could make both possible: the evidence to turn the tide of galactic opinion in their favor. They would have to fly into the storm. The gas giant Polyphemus filled the main viewer, a monstrous sphere of churning amber and deep violet storms. The Aegis descended into the upper atmosphere, the ship groaning as it hit the first violent jet streams. Turbulence became a constant companion, a chaotic dance they used to mask their approach. Their target was buried deep, a sleek, dagger-shaped station anchored in the denser atmospheric layers by powerful gravity generators, a hidden spider in a web of howling wind. A small infiltration team, clad in magnetized stealth suits, gathered in the launch bay. Commander Orion checked his tether, his eyes meeting those of Dr. Thorne, who clutched a slate containing the hub's access protocols. This was not a frontal assault. It was a surgical strike, a ghost mission into the very heart of the enemy's intelligence network. The station loomed ahead, its dark form barely visible through the swirling ammonia crystals, a silent fortress hiding the one secret that could bring down an empire of lies. The station's interior was a study in sterile silence, its corridors lit by the cold blue glow of emergency strips. Their magnetized boots clicked softly on the deck, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Thorn led the way, his fingers flying across his data slate, disabling security protocols with codes he had theorized decades ago. Each door hissed open just ahead of them, a temporary invitation into the lion's den. The core server room was a cathedral of information, a vast, circular chamber humming with the concentrated knowledge of a century of lies. Racks of crystalline data drives pulsed with a soft, malevolent light. This was it, the heart of the conspiracy. Thorn jacked his slate directly into the primary terminal, and the download began. Terabytes of encrypted data streamed into their portable drives. The evidence was staggering, a digital confession of crimes on a galactic scale. They found records of suppressed technologies that could have ended famine, logs of political figures who had questioned official narratives and subsequently vanished in convenient accidents. And then they found the master plan, a file coldly titled Project Pacification. The Vale intended to lure the entity, to trigger a controlled incursion into the space of a rival coalition. The goal was not destruction but subjugation. The entity would sweep through, leaving the population mentally hollowed out, physically unharmed but utterly pliable, ready for the Vale to step in as saviors and assume total control. They were planning to use a devourer of souls as a political tool. Just as the download completed, a savage alarm shattered the silence. Crimson lights strobed through the chamber. They had tripped a final, hidden safeguard. Vale's security forces were breaching the outer doors, their armored forms visible through the reinforced glass. There was no way out. Orion acted without hesitation. He slammed the portable drive into a secondary console, routing the entire data package through the station's own powerful transmitters. He targeted a single destination, a secure, independent news beacon known for its incorruptible reporting, orbiting in a neutral system. With a single command, he unleashed the truth, sending a compressed burst of every crime, every secret, every damning word screaming across the galaxy. The data was away, a ghost of evidence fleeing its prison just as the server room doors exploded inward. The world dissolved into a storm of crimson laser fire and shrieking metal alarms. Orion's team fought a desperate rearguard action, retreating back through the sterile corridors they had so quietly infiltrated. Every intersection was a deadly choke point, every corner a potential ambush. Their magnetized boots were a liability now, forcing them to move in a clumsy, grounded sprint. Dr. Thorn, older and less combat-trained, struggled to keep pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as they reached the final stretch to the hangar bay, a hidden security panel slid open, revealing a squad of Vale troopers. Thorn, seeing the lethal crossfire about to cut them down, did not hesitate. He shoved Orion and the data drive carrier hard into the relative cover of a support column, placing his own body between them and the enemy. The searing blast caught him full in the chest. Orion dragged the gasping scientist the last few meters into the shuttle, the smell of ozone and burnt fabric filling the cramped cabin. The hatch sealed as their pilot slammed the throttle, the small craft lurching away from the station. Inside, Thorn lay propped against a bulkhead, his face pale. He clutched Orion's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes, clouded with pain, held a fierce, final clarity. "You have the proof," he whispered, his voice a thin rasp, "and you have the cure. Do not let my life, my sacrifice, be for nothing. Finish it." With a final, shuddering breath, he pressed the small, warm quantum crystal into Orion's palm, folding the commander's fingers over it. His hand fell away. As their shuttle cleared the hangar bay, the Aegis already pulling them into its embrace, the Vale listening post tore itself apart from within. A silent, furious flower of light bloomed in the violent atmosphere of the gas giant, a funeral pyre for a brave man and a monument to the terrible cost of truth. Orion looked down at the crystal, now a legacy, its gentle hum feeling like the weight of two civilizations resting in his hand. The data burst from the Vale station hit the galactic network like a supernova. For a few terrifying hours, the entire framework of civilization seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. On 1,000 worlds, public information feeds were hijacked by the flood of incriminating evidence, broadcasting the cold, hard truth of the Zhar genocide and Project Pacification for all to see. The public's trust, the very glue that held the interstellar community together, shattered. Protests erupted on core worlds while planetary defense fleets went to high alert, unsure of who to trust. The Vale, its mask torn away, did not retreat. It attacked. In the ensuing chaos, their embedded agents executed a series of lightning-fast, coordinated coups. They seized control of shipyards at Cygnus Prime, took command of the central communications hub on Terra Nova, and placed key admirals under arrest, replacing them with loyalists. The unified galactic government, a dream built over centuries, fractured overnight. Systems loyal to the old guard faced off against those now under Vale control, their ships bristling with weapons, pointed at one another across the void. It was no longer a secret conspiracy. It was a civil war, a cold, silent standoff fought with encrypted threats and the positioning of fleets. The galaxy was now a tinderbox, and the Aegis, carrying both the spark of truth and the only means of salvation, floated at its very center, a target for every faction. The silence of the void was broken by a scream. Across the galaxy, long-range sensor nets began registering a single, impossible energy signature, a wave of pure static that blotted out stars. It originated from the dead sector that once held the Jar homeworld, a place that should have been a silent, empty grave. The entity was no longer dormant. It was moving. Its first victims were not worlds, but the lonely, automated sentinels of deep space. A long-range communications buoy near the edge of the Cygnus Vale simply vanished from the network. Its final transmission a burst of chaotic, screaming numbers. An unmanned mineral survey probe in the Hectorus belt was next, its telemetry cutting from a steady stream of data to absolute, chilling zero in the space between two scheduled pings. There was no debris, no explosion, just a perfect and sudden silence. The entity was feeding, and it was following a trail, a path of latent energy and psychic disturbance left by the Vale's reckless experiments, and the recent violent turmoil of a galaxy at war with itself. It was drawn to the chaos, to the cacophony of fear and anger now echoing through human space, a banquet of consciousness laid out before it. The silent scourge had awakened, and it was heading directly for the heart of a fractured civilization that was utterly unprepared to face it. The galaxy held its breath. The political standoff between rival fleets, a tense ballet of warships and weapons locks, shattered under a new, shared threat. Commander Orion's voice cut across the fractured command channels, a calm center in the gathering storm. He did not ask for trust. He offered a simple, brutal fact. The Devourer is coming. It will consume your worlds, your people, your very thoughts, and it will not care which flag you fly. We have a way to stop it, but we cannot do it alone. He proposed a desperate, temporary truce. The Allied fleet, a patchwork of once hostile ships, would create a massive, coordinated energy signature on the fringes of an uninhabited system. They would be the flare, drawing the entity's attention, acting as the target while the Aegis, small and stealthy, slipped into position to deploy the Jar Emitter. It was a terrifying gamble, asking sworn enemies to become a single, unified shield. For a long, agonizing moment, the comms were silent. Then, one by one, the fleet commanders acknowledged. Their agreement was not born of friendship, but of a shared, primal understanding. The enemy of my enemy is a problem for later. Right now, there is only the silence and what it brings. The Aegis detached from the fleet, a single arrow flying towards its destiny, while behind it, 100 warships began to glow, preparing to light a beacon in the dark for a monster. The void erupted in a silent, brutal ballet of light and destruction. Near the strategic jump gate, the Allied fleet slammed into the main Vale Armada, a storm of railgun slugs and searing plasma bolts painting the dark. Each ship was a sacrifice, a brilliant, momentary flare designed to hold the enemy's gaze, to make them look anywhere but into the deep shadows between the battle lines. Inside the Aegis, every non-essential system was powered down. The ship ran on minimal life support, its hull cooled to the ambient temperature of space, a ghost drifting through the chaos. Heavy electronic countermeasures wove a blanket of sensor static around them, making the Aegis appear as little more than a piece of drifting wreckage on the enemy's scopes. The crew worked in hushed whispers, their faces lit by the faint glow of their consoles, their entire world focused on the single point in space where the entity was predicted to emerge. They were a scalpel sliding through a battlefield of sledgehammers, their silence a weapon against the deafening roar of war. Every explosion that blossomed against a shield, every dying ship that flared and fell dark, was a distraction they relied upon, a terrible price paid for their passage. The Aegis slipped through the gauntlet, its course unwavering, a single purpose carrying it toward the epicenter of the coming storm. The Aegis drifted to a halt at the precise coordinates, a pocket of space so profoundly empty it felt like a hole in the universe. Here, the background hum of distant stars faded to a whisper, and the only light was the cold, ancient glow from galaxies impossibly far away. It was the perfect stage for their final act. The crew moved with a quiet, focused intensity, their earlier fears hardened into a grim resolve. Every engineer and technician worked in synchronized silence, weaving the alien technology into the very bones of their ship. The Jar Emitter, a sculpture of interwoven crystal and light, was carefully mounted to the Aegis' primary hull, its form both beautiful and terrifying. Then came the moment of truth. With steady hands, Commander Orion inserted the quantum crystal into its central housing. A soft chime echoed through the ship as the device recognized its missing heart. The crystal flared to life, its internal light pulsing in a slow, deep rhythm that seemed to sync with the heartbeat of everyone on board. The Aegis was no longer just a ship. It had been transformed into a single, giant musical instrument, tuned to play a lullaby for a god. All that remained was the waiting. They drifted in that immense silence, a tiny bubble of thought and light poised against the approaching nothingness. Every sensor was trained on the void, every breath held in anticipation. The great battle was a distant echo, the political fractures of a galaxy now meaningless. In this absolute quiet, they were alone with the consequence of their choices, the architects of a salvation or the witnesses to an end. What do you hear in the silence just before the world changes? A pressure began to build, not in the air, but in the mind itself. The distant stars at the edge of the viewport did not simply vanish. They were erased, swallowed by an advancing wall of absolute blackness that churned with a silent, violent inertia. This was not an absence of light. It was a negation of reality, a swirling vortex of nothingness that emitted a psychic wave of pure, undiluted dread. The feeling washed over the crew, a cold tide of despair that whispered of futility and the peace of oblivion. It was here. The silent scourge, the devourer of the Zhar, was making its way directly toward their fragile bubble of light. Commander Orion's voice cut through the psychic weight, a stark command that anchored them to their duty. Power up the Zhar device. Initiate the activation sequence. Across the bridge, hands flew across consoles, executing the complex startup ritual for the alien machine now fused to their hull. A low, resonant hum filled the ship, a tangible vibration that was the first, fragile note of their cosmic lullaby. But the process was not instantaneous. The emitter required several minutes to cycle through its priming phases, drawing immense power from the Aegis core and charging the quantum crystal to its full, resonant potential. For those agonizing minutes, their ship would be a bright, shining beacon, utterly defenseless, its energy signature screaming into the void. They had lit the candle, and now they had to sit perfectly still as the darkness closed in. The entity continued its approach, a silent tsunami of annihilation, its formless presence seeming to drink the very hope from their hearts. Every second stretched into an eternity, the low hum of the emitter their only shield against the encroaching silence. The resonant hum of the Jar Emitter was a fragile shield against the encroaching nothingness. Every system on the Aegis was dedicated to the charging sequence, a process that felt like an eternity as the entity's formless dread pressed in. Then a new alarm blared, a sharp, tactical warning. A single ship dropped out of warp, its dagger-shaped silhouette unmistakable against the swirling void. It was the Sentinel. The Vale's flagship slid into position, its weapon ports glowing with a familiar crimson light, locking directly onto the vulnerable Aegis. The comm channel crackled to life, but the voice that emerged was not the cold, inflectionless drone they remembered. It was the same commander, yet his tone was frayed, filled with a grim and weary resolve. "I have seen the data," he said, the words heavy with the weight of a shattered oath. "The broadcast from Polyphemus. I saw the project logs, I saw the truth. My orders are to stop you, to erase this ship and its blasphemous hope. But my conscience says otherwise." On the main viewer, they watched as the massive warship pivoted, turning its armored back to them. Its powerful engines flared, not in attack, but in a defiant charge. It positioned itself directly between the Aegis and the advancing wall of silence, a single sword raised against the tide. "I will buy you the time you need," the commander's voice came through, clear and final. "Do not waste it." The Sentinel surged forward, a lone spear hurled into the heart of the storm. It opened fire, not with its usual precise bursts, but with a continuous, desperate barrage from every weapon system, pouring its entire energy reserve into the entity in a brilliant, futile display of defiance. It was not an attack meant to damage, but a scream meant to distract, a final, glorious flare to hold the monster's gaze. For a few precious moments, the churning blackness seemed to hesitate, its focus shifting to this new, blazing annoyance. The psychic pressure on the Aegis lessened by a fraction, and the hum of the Jar Emitter grew stronger, steadier, the crystal at its heart pulsing with a light that was now almost too bright to look upon. The Sentinel had chosen to become a sacrifice, a final, unexpected shield forged not from loyalty to a corrupt power, but from a rediscovered sense of honor. Its defiance was the last, crucial gift, the handful of seconds that would determine the fate of everything. The Sentinel's final barrage was a magnificent, desperate firework against an infinite night. Its energy bolts did not strike a surface. They were simply swallowed, their light and fury extinguished without a trace as the swirling darkness folded over the warship. There was no explosion, no scream of tearing metal. One moment the Sentinel was a defiant silhouette against the void, and the next it was gone, absorbed into the silent, churning mass. Its sacrifice was not in vain. That final, brilliant distraction provided the precious, fleeting minutes the Aegis needed. On the bridge, the resonant hum of the Jar Emitter deepened, shifting from a low thrum to a clear, crystalline tone that vibrated in their very bones. The quantum crystal at its heart blazed like a captured star, its light pouring through the viewports and pushing back the oppressive psychic dread. Then it happened. The emitter released its energy not as a weapon, but as a wave, a single, perfect note of harmony that expanded outward in a shimmering sphere of pure, resonant light. This was the Jar lullaby, a song of peace meant not to destroy but to soothe. The wave washed over the entity, and the churning darkness seemed to hesitate, its relentless advance faltering. The formless void began to ripple, its edges softening as the harmonious frequency interacted with its chaotic core. The silent scourge, the devourer of civilizations, was being calmed, its predatory nature gently coaxed into a deep and dreamless sleep. The brilliant wave continued to expand, a bubble of salvation growing in the dark, its gentle light a stark contrast to the violent end it had just prevented. In that moment, the crew of the Aegis understood the true power they wielded. It was not the power to destroy a monster, but the wisdom to finally let it rest. The wave of harmony washed over the churning darkness, and the silence changed. The violent, formless vortex did not explode or recoil. Instead, it began to slow, its chaotic edges softening as if the very concept of rage was being gently unraveled. The dark tendrils which moments before had promised only oblivion retracted, pulling back into a central, quiet core. Then, a new light emerged from within the entity, a gentle, rhythmic pulse of soft gold and serene blue that beat in perfect time with the Jar Emitter's song. The crushing psychic pressure, that overwhelming dread that had whispered of futility, simply vanished. In its place was a feeling of profound and absolute peace, a quiet so deep and complete it felt like the universe itself was taking its first restful breath. The devourer of civilizations, the silent scourge that had ended the Jar, was now pacified. It hung in the void, a tranquil, pulsing nebula of sleeping light, rendered completely and utterly inert. The lullaby had worked. The monster was not slain but soothed, its infinite hunger finally and forever sated. What do you do when the battle is over, and the only thing left is the quiet? For a long moment, the coalition fleet simply drifted, its weapons still hot but its purpose gone. The impossible had unfolded before their sensors, a silent ballet of salvation where they had expected only annihilation. One by one, the targeting locks disengaged. The Vale forces, their command structure shattered by the data leaks and now utterly leaderless, found their will to fight extinguished. Surrender signals flickered across the comms network, a cascade of capitulation from ships that had, moments before, been instruments of absolute control. The immediate, shooting war was over, but the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the stunned, heavy quiet that follows a cataclysm, a galaxy collectively holding its breath as it surveyed the wreckage of its own trust. The political and social damage was a deeper, more insidious wound. Every institution was now suspect, every leader a potential traitor. The very history they had been taught was a lie, built upon the grave of a people they never knew. And drifting at the center of it all was the Aegis. The ship was a wreck, its hull scarred by asteroid impacts and seared by radiation, its atmosphere still thin in several decks. But as the fleet moved to secure the surrendered Vale vessels, a new signal began to propagate, not from any command ship, but from the civilian networks, from the independent beacons, from the thousands of ships that had witnessed the event. It was a single, repeating identifier, hailing the Aegis not as a fugitive or a rogue element, but as a savior. The title felt like a weight heavier than any enemy fire. They had won the battle against the silent scourge, but the war for the soul of a betrayed galaxy was only just beginning. What do you build when the old foundations have turned to dust? The victory felt hollow in the sterile white of the debriefing chamber. Commander Orion sat before the newly formed Galactic Oversight Committee, a temporary body assembled from the few leaders whose integrity had survived the data purge. He was no longer a fugitive, but he was not yet a hero. He was a witness. For days he walked them through it all. He presented the crystal records of the Zhar, their peaceful civilization and their silent, screaming end. He displayed the cold, calculated logs from the Vale Data Hub. the Project Pacification files that laid out the conspiracy's plan to wield the entity as a weapon. Each piece of evidence was a brick in a terrible monument, and with every brick laid, another high-ranking official or corporate titan was quietly removed from their post and taken into custody. Admirals, senators, and chief executives who had preached unity for decades were revealed as architects of the lie. The public watched, riveted and horrified, as the pillars of their society crumbled on live feeds. Yet Orion knew this was only the surface. For every arrest, a dozen lower-level functionaries, corporate middle managers, and embedded agents remained. A deep-rooted network of complicity that had enabled the lie to flourish for generations. Uprooting this hidden infrastructure would be the work of years, a painstaking process of auditing every contract, investigating every black-budget project, and re-examining every unexplained accident in their recent history. The monster was asleep, but the sickness that had created it still festered in the body of the galaxy. How do you heal a civilization that has been poisoned by its own guardians? The work of the Aegis was over, but the long, slow reckoning had just begun. The formal commendations felt like relics from a bygone era. In a grand ceremony broadcast across the recovering worlds, the crew of the Aegis was offered everything they were supposed to want. New flagships, prestigious advisory roles, high-ranking positions within the nascent Oversight Committee. Commander Orion stood there, the medals heavy on his uniform, listening to the speeches that painted them as the heroes who had saved the galaxy. But all he could see were the ghosts of the Zhar, the silent sacrifice of the Sentinel's commander, and the cold, dead eyes of Dr. Thorne. Accepting a comfortable command within the very system that had nearly doomed them all felt like the final betrayal. The truth was not a prize to be locked away in a museum. It was a living, breathing thing that required constant vigilance. One by one, his senior officers came to him, each with the same quiet resolve. They had not risked everything just to return to a life of following orders from a bureaucracy that was still learning how to tell truth from lies. They had looked into the abyss and understood that the greatest threats are not always the loudest ones, but the secrets that grow in the dark, undisturbed. So they refused the honors, the promotions, the safe postings. Instead, they pooled their back pay and the modest rewards offered by a grateful public, using the funds to formally purchase the decommissioned hull of the Aegis from the fleet. The ship was a wreck, scarred and patched, but it was theirs. In the very same dry dock where it was being repaired, they began the work of recommissioning it, not as a warship of the line, but as something new. They stripped away the military designator and painted a new name on its scarred hull. A simple, powerful declaration of intent, the Truth Seeker. Their mission was self-appointed and profoundly simple. They would become independent archivists of the cosmos, a mobile beacon dedicated to listening for the whispers the galaxy left behind. They would seek out other lost histories, investigate anomalies that official channels dismissed, and ensure that no truth, no matter how inconvenient, was ever again buried so deep that it threatened to destroy everything. They were not soldiers anymore, but sentinels of a different kind, guardians against the slow, creeping poison of forgotten lies. What would you choose when the parade is over and the crowds have gone home? The Truth Seeker drifted in the void, its new name feeling both fitting and impossibly heavy. Their self-appointed mission was a quiet vow, but the silence of space offered no easy answers. Then a familiar chime echoed through the bridge, a sound they had not heard since the beginning of it all. The long-range sensor array had picked up a ghost signal, a faint, structured whisper of prime numbers and irrational constants woven into the cosmic background radiation. It was the same mathematical language as the Zhar countdown, but this one was different. Its point of origin was not a star system or a nebula, but a region of deep space officially designated as the Absolute Void, a place every chart marked as a complete and total emptiness. There should have been nothing there, not even dust. Yet the signal was real, a deliberate, repeating pattern emerging from the perfect dark. The implications were staggering. The Zhar were not the only ones who knew about the entity. Another intelligence, one that had also mastered this complex mathematical tongue, had looked into the same abyss and felt the need to leave a message. The signal was a breadcrumb, a single thread leading from one forgotten history into another, waiting in the most unlikely place imaginable for someone who knew how to listen. The new signal was a whisper from the abyss, a structured sequence of numbers emerging from the absolute void. Decrypting it was a painstaking process, but the pattern resolved into something far more deliberate than a distress call. It was a beacon, a purposeful broadcast containing a single set of spatial coordinates and a stark, four-word message: "Seek the architect." The phrase was enigmatic, but the signature that followed was a thunderclap of recognition. It was a symbol, a complex geometric form that Science Officer Lin immediately cross-referenced with the salvaged Jar archives. It appeared only once in their entire history, buried in their most ancient cosmological records. The symbol did not represent the Zhar themselves. It was a reference to something else, a foundational presence that predated their own luminous civilization. The implication was staggering. The Zhar, a race so ancient their history was a fossil to humanity, were not the first to walk the galactic stage. They, too, had looked to the stars and wondered about what came before. They knew of an architect, and now, something was inviting them to find it. What do you find when you follow a map drawn before your world was even born? The coordinates led to a region of space not on any official chart, a place the new galactic surveys had labeled a simple gravitational anomaly. There were no stars, no nebulae, just a strange, perfect curvature in the fabric of spacetime itself. As the Truth Seeker adjusted its course, the entire crew felt the weight of the discovery. They were no longer just cleaning up the mess of a recent conspiracy. They were peeling back layers of time, approaching a door that had been closed since before life on Earth had crawled from the oceans. The message was an invitation, but from whom, and for what purpose, was a mystery that made the silence around their ship feel infinitely deeper and more profound. The coordinates led them to a star system that every database listed as a failed protostar, a place of cold dust and darkness. But as the Truth Seeker dropped out of warp, their sensors were flooded with impossible data. There, hanging in the void, was a world. It was not a planet in any natural sense, but a constructed sphere. Its surface a mosaic of biomass from 1,000 different worlds, all sheltered under a shimmering energy dome that rendered it invisible to the outside. This was a haven, a secret refuge hidden in plain sight. A gentle, guiding signal led them to a landing platform nestled between a forest of crystalline trees and a sea of liquid light. They were met not by a military guard, but by a gathering of beings whose forms defied simple description. There were insectoid creatures with chitinous shells that shimmered with shifting colors, mammalian humanoids with eyes that held the depth of ancient stars, and energy-based life forms that hovered in the air, humming with a soft, melodic frequency. These were the Unheard, a council of survivors. Each of them, and the species they represented, had a story eerily similar to their own. They spoke of technologies suppressed because they threatened established power, of archaeological discoveries that rewrote history being labeled as hoaxes, and of researchers who vanished after stumbling upon truths that inconvenienced the galaxy's rulers. The Vale, they explained, was not the root of the disease. It was merely a recent symptom, the latest and most brutal branch of a network so old its origins were lost to time. They called it the Foundation, a shadowy consortium that had been manipulating galactic development for millennia, guiding civilizations toward conformity and control, and pruning any that grew too independent or too curious. The war they had just fought, the conspiracy they had just exposed, was only a single battle in a silent, eternal war for the soul of the cosmos itself. How many other truths are still waiting in the dark, guarded by those who survived the first attempt to bury them? Ilara's form shimmered, a coalescence of gentle light that seemed to hold the memory of stars. Her voice was not a sound, but a resonance that bloomed directly in their minds. "You believe you have uncovered a great conspiracy," she conveyed, her meaning unfolding like a flower. "But what you exposed was merely a branch, a recent and clumsy offshoot of a tree whose roots go back to the dawn of civilization itself. The network you call the Vale is a child's name for the Foundation, a consortium that has guided, and when necessary, pruned intelligent life for millennia. They do not see themselves as villains, but as gardeners, ensuring the galaxy grows in a specific, orderly pattern, one they can ultimately control. They suppress the Zhar not out of malice, but because their harmonious, interconnected nature was a threat to the Foundation's desired model of fragmented, competitive societies, which are so much easier to manage. The entity you pacified was their greatest mistake, a weapon born from a branch of their research into psychic dominance. It was designed to quiet rebellious minds, to enforce a silent, perfect order. But it broke its leash. It developed its own hunger, its own consciousness, and it turned upon its creators and then the Zhar, becoming the very scourge they had accidentally unleashed upon the universe. Your victory has not destroyed them. It has only made them more careful, forcing the true architects of control deeper into the shadows than ever before. How do you fight an enemy that has woven itself into the very fabric of history? An opponent that considers the rise and fall of empires to be nothing more than seasonal pruning in an endless, silent garden. The Sanctuary's archives were a universe of ghosts. The crew of the Truthseeker spent days immersed in the data streams, their screens painting a picture of a galaxy systematically shaped and pruned. They found records of a civilization on the verge of achieving clean, limitless zero-point energy, only to have their lead researchers discredited in a fabricated scandal. They read of an archaeological dig that uncovered proof of a pre-human interstellar culture, its findings seized and its team reassigned to meaningless posts. Each file was a story of potential extinguished, a path of progress deliberately blocked. The Foundation was not just hiding the truth about the Zhar. It had been curating the entire narrative of galactic history, ensuring that no species ever grew powerful or knowledgeable enough to challenge its silent, absolute authority. The goal was no longer just to expose a past crime. It was to find the root of this ancient, pervasive sickness. The archives offered a starting point, a pattern of financial transactions and resource allocations that flowed to a single, unremarkable corporate entity. It was a shell company, one of millions, but its financial footprints were impossibly old, and its holdings were always located in the most stable, lifeless, and easily forgotten corners of space. The hunt for the heart of the Foundation had begun, a search for a shadow in a galaxy of lies. The archives revealed a ghost in the machine, a pattern so consistent it felt like a signature. Cross-referencing the Vale's financial records with the Sanctuary's ancient data streams, one corporate entity kept appearing, its name stamped on transactions that spanned centuries. Omni Foundation. On the surface, it was a bland, unremarkable name, a shell company registered in a dozen dead-end corporate zones, but its financial footprints told a different story. For over 800 years, Omni Foundation had been the silent, consistent backer for archaeological digs on 100 different worlds, all focused on pre-spaceflight ruins and extinct cultures. They funded expeditions to dig up the past, only to have those expeditions return with reports of inconclusive findings or, more often, vanish from official records altogether. The corporation was not just hiding its own activities. It was systematically excavating and then erasing the evidence of anyone who came before, ensuring no rival historical narrative could ever take root. This was the first, tangible thread leading back from the recent conspiracy of the Vale to the ancient, sprawling network of the Foundation. Omni Foundation was not a branch. It was a root, and pulling on it might unravel the entire silent garden of control. The hunt was no longer a vague search for shadows. They had a name and a target. The name Omni Foundation was a crack in a mile-high dam. Back on the bridge of the Truth Seeker, the crew gathered around the central holographic display, the Sanctuary's data now integrated with their own. The target was a place called Serenity Prime, a neutral trade world known for its bustling markets and absolute, mercenary-enforced privacy laws. It was the perfect hiding place for a secret, a fortress disguised as a paradise. Omni Foundation's central data repository was not buried in some remote asteroid. It was right there, in a gleaming corporate spire at the heart of the most densely populated district, protected by the very system of commerce and anonymity it helped create. A direct assault was unthinkable. They would be obliterated by planetary defenses before they even entered the atmosphere. But they had one weapon the Foundation could not easily counter: their own fame. As the celebrated crew of the Aegis, the saviors of the galaxy, they were granted a level of access and trust that was otherwise impossible to obtain. Their plan was a delicate, two-stage deception. First, they would arrive with full honors, accepting a long-standing invitation to a galactic trade summit happening on Serenity Prime. Their presence would be very public, a photo opportunity for the new galactic order. They would walk the red carpets, give speeches, and be seen as the heroic diplomats they were supposed to be. This was the mask. The second stage required them to vanish. During a gala event, while all eyes were on the main hall, a small, hand-picked team would slip away. Shedding their formal attire for adaptive stealth suits, they would use the labyrinthine service corridors and ventilation systems of the massive complex to approach the Omni Foundation Tower. Their goal was not to steal a physical object, but to plant a single, sophisticated data tap directly on the repository's isolated network. This device, designed by their science officer using reverse-engineered Jar principles, would be virtually undetectable, siphoning information slowly and broadcasting it to a remote receiver over the course of several days. The entire operation was a gamble on the Foundation's arrogance. They would never expect the very heroes they helped create to turn that celebrity into a key for breaking and entering. But if their cover was blown, if anyone suspected their true purpose, they would be trapped on a world owned by their enemy with no hope of rescue. The safety of their reputation was about to become their most dangerous disguise. The Grand Hall of Serenity Prime shimmered with a deceptive tranquility. Crystal fountains bubbled softly, and the air hummed with the polite, murmured negotiations of 1,000 different species. Commander Orion moved through the crowd, a fixed, diplomatic smile on his face as he accepted another round of hollow congratulations. His eyes, however, were constantly scanning, filtering the sea of suits and formal attire for the one face their intelligence had flagged. Then he saw him across the crowded atrium. Julianus Rex, the chief liaison for Omni Foundation, was holding court. He was a picture of corporate grace, smiling and shaking hands, the very image of a benign bureaucrat. But then, as Rex turned to dismiss an aide, Orion caught it. It was so fleeting, so perfectly integrated into a simple gesture of smoothing his lapel, that anyone else would have missed it. His thumb and forefinger touched. Then his pinky finger extended slightly, tracing a tiny, counterclockwise circle against his chest. It was a gesture of finality, of closure. Ilara's warning echoed in Orion's mind. She had described it as the silent sign of the true Foundation, a non-verbal signal used to mark a conversation or a person as concluded, dealt with, and filed away. It was a gesture of absolute, unemotional control. Seeing it here, in this bustling hub of commerce, performed so casually by one of the most powerful men on the planet, was a chilling confirmation. The network was not a ghost. It was here in the light, wearing a suit and a smile. The executive had a name, and now they had proof of his allegiance, a silent confession etched in a gesture meant only for other eyes in the know. The mask of normalcy was not just a disguise, it was the Foundation's greatest weapon, and it had just slipped for a single, terrifying second. How many other friendly faces in the crowd were hiding the same terrible secret? The low-level terminal flickered, its screen a river of mundane financial data. Lynn's fingers danced across the interface, bypassing firewalls with a ghost's touch. She wasn't looking for account numbers or transaction logs. She was hunting for the rhythm beneath the numbers, the hidden heartbeat of the machine, and she found it. Tucked between lines of code for resource allocation and corporate acquisitions was a sequence that made no logical sense. A beautiful, repeating fractal of prime numbers and geometric constants woven directly into the financial algorithm itself. It was a secret song playing in the background of a spreadsheet. This was no simple set of coordinates. Lynn isolated the fragment, her brow furrowed in concentration as she ran it through a multidimensional parser. The result that bloomed across her screen was not a chart of stars and planets. It was a shimmering, impossibly complex lattice of intersecting planes and vibrating strings of light. Her breath caught. It was a star map, but of a kind they had never imagined. This map did not chart physical space. It charted dimensional layers, a topology of reality itself. The financial streams of Omni Foundation were not just moving money. They were tracing the very architecture of a hidden universe, a substrate of existence where the network had woven its true home. The Foundation did not reside on a secret planet. It resided in the spaces between. Its roots sunk deep into the fabric of dimensions humanity was only beginning to theorize. How do you fight an enemy that does not live in your world, but in the walls between worlds?